Hi, friends. It's Lynn Cox, and I'm here with Wednesday Wonderings. This is a four-part series, and today is September 2nd, and it's part 3 of 4. So this series is for all of my subscribers, and it's also for the members of the Washington Ethical Society, where I have just started as the interim leader. Washington Ethical Society is a vibrant humanistic congregation in Washington, D.C., and I'm so pleased that I get to work with them during their interim time. So if you follow Wes at all, you know that this past Sunday, our platform included a question box, which is that I had a few prepared remarks for the platform address, and then I opened it up to questions that people submitted in advance. And people submitted many great questions. And so I didn't want to hold people on Zoom for their entire Sunday. I knew they had to get lunch and feed their dogs and all those other things. So I answered a few questions on Sunday, and then I saved the rest, and I'll get to one or two today, and I'll get to some in my blog posts, but we will get to all those questions. Anyway, welcome to Wednesday Wonderings. I'm glad you're here. If you're watching live, you can feel free to participate in the live chat. Lots of people are watching later, so you can submit a comment if you prefer to do that. You're definitely welcome to subscribe so that you can get an alert when I go live, and it would be great to have you in the community. So, like I said, this is part 3 of 4. So next Wednesday, I'll do another live, and then we'll see. We'll see how this is reaching folks, how people are responding, if there's another schedule or another platform, another venue that's going to work better for you. So let me know. Okay, obviously we're not in the garden again. It's raining today, and I didn't want to take my computer out in the rain, but I will give you a report, which is that I have a little garden, and I say that I'm a clueless gardener. I'm not a great gardener, but I do give it some effort. So I'm growing a couple of things in big containers, and I'm growing a couple of things in raised beds. And one of the things I discovered is that beans are a lot more successful than I expected. I was like, oh, I'll just grow some corn and beans and squash in this 4x8 raised bed. And I put up some bamboo for the beans to climb on, and it just kept going. And so it overshadowed the corn, so no corn. But I have about 4 pounds of beans in my fridge right now, aside from what we've already eaten and what I've managed to sneak onto the doorsteps of family members. So you never know what might happen when you provide adequate support, right? Can't control outcomes, but you never know what might happen when you provide adequate support. So that's what I'm taking with me today out of the garden. And that's my garden report. Okay, while we're on the subject of growing, one of the questions in the question box was, how can WES members live in greener ways to help reduce effects of global warming? So I wanted to answer this in a couple of ways. I'm really glad that we're thinking about how our ethical principles apply to the planet that we share, because that's definitely part of ethical behavior, right? It's some of the things that we want to think about. And I think that for a lot of us, we already know some of the answers about how we can live green in our individual lives. And the Earth Ethics team at WES is thinking about how we can live greener in our building, right? Where they are in the process of getting some trees planted on the property. I think that there's a partnership happening involving a community garden, and I want to learn more about that. We want to think about how the way we use energy when we're back in the building institutionally supports our climate goals. I know that there's a team that washes dishes when we can meet together and eat together, and that helps us to reduce our use of disposables. So there are some things we can do institutionally, and I think that you know that if you live in a place where you can control your energy usage, there's always something you can do there. If you live in a place where you can control what pesticides you do or don't use in your outdoor areas, that's something you can control. We can control not washing our clothes if we don't have to, right? Maybe re-wearing our pants a couple of times. Um, some of us can control where we purchase our electricity from. Some of us have the wherewithal to be able to reduce our use of fossil fuels in our transportation. And some of us don't have that power because we depend on the bus, or we just can't afford a car that is low fuel using. But we can all do those little parts. And I also wanted to say that I don't want us to get so caught up in our individual green lifestyles that we stop having time to advocate for systemic responses to climate change. It's my understanding that the idea of a personal carbon footprint actually came out of British Petroleum. It came out of BP oil in a way to try to shift the conversation away from industrial and governmental and whole systems change to combat climate change, and put the burden on individual people to think about our responsible choices. We do want to make responsible individual choices, and we cannot let governments and large corporations off the hook. During the quarantine, when economies slowed down significantly and people stayed home, we did see some effects on carbon emissions. What we're not necessarily seeing is a drastic reduction in CO2 that's still in the atmosphere, right? So we still need to be working on carbon capture technologies. But keep in mind that those carbon emission reductions came because of governmental action that allowed people to stay home, governmental action that allowed factories to shut down. And also keep in mind that those are temporary, right? They didn't come with systemic change about how we relate to each other and how we do business and how products move from place to place. They are associated with an economic decline. Last 100 years, carbon emissions, slight reduction when there's an economic decline. But depending on economic decline for our carbon emissions goals may not be the way we want to go about it, right? We have to completely upend the way we do business and the way we enact government regulations for carbon output and for carbon capture and for all of the things that we do that affect the climate. So what I think the lesson is of the carbon emissions reduction during coronavirus is that it can be done, right? We can, with widespread action and government support and rethinking how we're doing economics, we can actually make a difference. And it's not enough, right? We need to keep going. Individuals deciding to stay home is not enough. The other thing that, if I understand correctly, and I'll put links in the comments after this gets posted, is that we see different effects in different places. In China, where there's a lot of manufacturing, shutting down the factories made a huge difference. In the US, where everybody who could went to work at home but didn't stop working, a lot of our energy usage and emissions just shifted places, right? Instead of energy usage in office buildings, there was more energy usage at home. Instead of garbage being piled up in businesses, we had more residential garbage. And at the same time, less ability to handle our residential garbage. The other thing that we're seeing is that we are having a more difficult time with recycling during coronavirus, that because of the very low oil prices and because of staffing shortages, because of people being ill and other impacts, in addition to some other things that were already going on in the recycling industry, it is harder to recycle, for instance, plastic. And we're seeing a lot more single-use plastic. And some of that we need to, because for medical applications, there's not necessarily a replacement for single-use plastic. But for our daily lives might be including more single-use plastic right now. And it's harder to recycle those things. I live in Baltimore, and we're finding that our whole waste management issue is disrupted during coronavirus. So we do want to live greener. We want to recycle as much as we can. And there's some obstacles put in our way right now up the chain because there are fewer places that are accepting recyclables. So again, if we want to impact climate change, we can't just be thinking in terms of our individual choices. But back to the first hand, our individual choices do matter because they ground us in our ethics. They remind us what we're trying to do. They remind us to be connected with the earth and to be connected with the idea that we're all sharing this planet. So, for me, in my clueless garden, I don't put in, synthetic pesticides. Like I might spray some neem oil or some soap on the bugs that are eating my milkweed, but I'm not going to put Roundup in my garden. We don't spray our lawn. Our neighbors might like it if we had more grass and less clover in our lawn, but that's how we do. I try to grow some of this food so that our family can shorten the food supply chain a little bit, but I'm never going to be able to grow enough to feed our family all year. So there's things that I can do that help keep me grounded, that remind me that I'm part of the earth, that help me teach my children where their food actually comes from. And those are important. And, I sometimes fantasize about just going off and living on a sustainable farm all by ourselves and going off the grid. And that's a lifestyle for some people that they find really meaningful. And if I did that, would I have time to support you as a community in doing the advocacy work and the governmental work? And I know some of you work in local and state and national government offices where you're trying to affect some of these changes that we need systemically. And if I were spending all of my time trying to live a perfectly moral individual life from a sustainable perspective, I don't know that I would have time to also support a community where we can gather our strength for the systemic change that we really need to impact climate change. So those are balancing acts, right? I also want to remember about privilege, right? That some of us have the privilege to make possibly more expensive choices that depend on having our own growing space, choices that depend on living someplace where we don't have an apartment complex or a homeowners association that prohibits sustainable choices. And also in terms of ableism, a year or two ago, there was a lot of conversation about banning plastic straws. And our friends in the disability justice community were asking us to slow down because having single-use plastic straws available as a public accommodation was one of the things they needed to feel like they were included in the community. They are included in the community, right? That for somebody who maybe has muscular disability and they can't lift and hold a glass full of liquid very easily, they need a straw, and paper straws don't hold up to some beverages, and corn straws cause allergies for some people. So there needed to be a lot more conversation about how we can be inclusive from a disability justice perspective, and also think about how to provide options so that those who don't need plastic straws don't need to use them. And again, the whole debate about plastic straws obscured the industrial causes of some of the marine pollution that is killing sea turtles, mostly fishing waste. So again, let's make the most ethical choices we can in our individual lives, and also not forget the bigger picture and not forget the people with whom we are in relationship. So thinking kind of more than individual, but less than global, because sometimes the global can be overwhelming. Let's also think about who are we in partnership locally, who's advocating for local sustainable solutions and local environmental justice, right? That we want to follow the lead of the people who are most impacted. If you happen to know that you live in a city where poor neighborhoods and neighborhoods that are mostly populated by people of color are where we put trash incinerators, industrial areas, train tracks carrying oil cars. What are the residents of those areas doing to stand up for themselves? And how can neighbors in surrounding areas support them in their voices and their leadership in creating environmentally safe and healthy places for people to live? There are indigenous groups that are advocating for sovereignty, for the US to keep their treaties with them, for not having oil pipelines put through their tribal lands or in places that threaten the waters that they depend on in their tribal lands. How can we be in solidarity? If you're not indigenous, how can we be in solidarity with indigenous communities that are defending their health and environments and way of life? Right. So again, organizing, but organizing doesn't have to be on such a large governmental scale that you can't grasp it. It can be about relationships, starting with one community's relationship with another community, right? Starting with people who can be together on a Zoom meeting right now, but eventually people who can be together at a potluck so that we can talk about our common ground and our common cause. All of that is climate justice. All of that is affecting climate change. So I do hope that you're thinking about what is one more thing that you can do for climate justice this week. What is one more way that you can feel connected to climate healing? And remembering that it's not about the individual, that this is about us as a planet, as a whole ecosystem that we're part of. And I think that is also a great exercise in our ethical imagination to remember that it's more than that our individual choices matter, and that we are connected to a much bigger network that also matters, and our choices as a collective in that network matter. Okay, so we might have time for another question from the question box. One of our friends asks, as people struggle to cope, I've heard a lot of comments along the lines of everything happens for a reason, or what are we supposed to learn from this? The implication that there's a supernatural intention behind events often goes unchallenged, and I find that alienating and disappointing. While I want people who believe in God to also feel welcome, much of American society is averse to atheists. How do you help ensure West is a welcoming place for atheists like me? So there's a lot packed into that question. To start with, for Wes, I think just acknowledging who's in the room, right? Remembering that Wes is a humanistic congregation and there's no expectation of a belief in a deity, but there's also not a rejection of members who happen to believe in a deity. It's just not what we're going to be talking about when we're together. I think that we want to not jump on people for speaking about their personal beliefs, right? And what we can do is create alternative frameworks that are congruent with atheism or agnosticism in the space that we share. So I'm not going to say that everything happens for a reason. I actually think everything happens for a reason is not necessarily kind to people who are going through a tragedy. Right? It implies that there is a consciousness that chose suffering for you. And I don't know that the person who is suffering needs to hear that. I think that much suffering that happens in the world happens because of human choices. And saying that everything happens for a reason lets humans off the hook. Now, some of those choices might be obscured. Some of those choices might be collective. Some of those choices are governmental choices, right? If I have a friend who's going through an illness, their illness is not necessarily a lesson, right? I'm not going to tell them that it's a lesson. Illness is something that is part of being a person with a body. And we have decided as a society that some of the suffering that goes along with being ill in the United States is acceptable. We've decided that it's acceptable to have a healthcare system with rampant disparities. We've decided that it's acceptable that our insurance companies make decisions about who lives and who dies. We've decided that it's acceptable to bankrupt people for trying to stay alive. That level of suffering is a choice that we've made as a society, mainly at governmental levels. So, is there a reason why somebody is facing housing insecurity now because of their medical bills? Well, the reason that happened is about collective ethical choices. It's not about a lesson that person needed to learn. So I don't generally say that everything happens for a reason. I also am not going to say that tragic events happen because we needed to learn something, right? I don't know that there's anything that can make suffering or a tragic event a good thing that happened. It may be that out of that experience, we can learn something that's valuable. But I don't think that's the reason for the experience. I don't think it excuses the experience. And I hope it's true that we can find the resilience to learn what we need to learn out of our challenges and apply those in ways that are increasingly just and compassionate for ourselves and our world. But that's not the same as being the reason for the suffering or for the tragic event. So perhaps what we can do as a community is offer alternative frameworks, right? Offer other ways of interpreting suffering that makes sense to someone who's an atheist, and that can also provide some depth and a way forward for people who are looking for meaning. People are going to continue to look for meaning. So what I hope we don't do is say our experiences are meaningless. There's nothing we can learn. There's nothing we can do except be with it, right? I hope that we can figure out ways of finding in our ethical systems, in the stories that we treasure, in the role models that we learn from, ways that we can find meaning in our difficult experiences. And it is absolutely possible to find meaning in a way that does not need room for a higher power. So that's our work to do, is to find that meaning. I also think that as part of that meaning making that we're doing in a humanistic way, that we need to remember that this is an emotional experience, right? We want something that will stand up to rational testing, but rationality by itself may not be enough, right? We need compassion, we need listening, we need stories, we need companionship. So when we are creating a place to make meaning together about our difficult experiences, it can't begin and end with rational philosophy by itself, right? That's part of the work. Creating a rationally defensible framework for how we understand the world and how we make meaning is part of the work. And there's more to it in how we gather together and comfort and challenge each other and how we help each other grow. So I hope that helps. Okay, we're getting close to time, so I'm going to let you go pretty soon. But thanks for joining me. Thanks for watching this video later. If you watched it later, thank you to the folks who decided to join me for the live stream. And I'll be back next week for one more Wednesday Wondering at 11 o'clock. So let's see, so that would be the 9th. And leave a comment. And after that, we'll figure out what's going to work best for helping us to connect and find different ways to learn about each other during this socially distanced part of our lives. Thanks for tuning in. It's great to see you. Take care.